Matt Weston had always dreamed of owning his own piece of tranquility, a home away from the noise of the world, where he could finally settle after years of moving from one rental to the next. At 47, after retiring from a physically demanding military career and transitioning into a new chapter as a project designer for a mid-sized construction firm, he had saved enough to purchase a modest but charming house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house itself wasn't grand, but it had all the potential Matt needed: a sturdy foundation, clean lines, and a spacious backyard. To Matt, it represented a chance to create something personal, a sanctuary he could shape with his own hands. From the moment Matt moved in, he was struck by how welcoming the neighborhood seemed, or at least how it pretended to be. On the second day of unpacking, his next-door neighbor, Grace Miller, appeared on his doorstep with a bright smile and a plate of cookies. She looked every bit the image of a kind, old-fashioned neighbor, a woman in her late 60s with carefully styled silver hair and a soft voice that carried a tone of warm authority. She introduced herself as a retired nurse and widow who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years. There was something disarming about her demeanor, like she had been watching him and decided now was the perfect time to introduce herself. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said cheerfully, handing him the plate of cookies. "I thought I'd come by and save you the trouble of wondering who's who. Everyone here is friendly, but we've all got our quirks. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to knock." Matt thanked her politely, not entirely sure how to respond. Grace's energy was a little overwhelming after a long day of lifting boxes, but he appreciated the gesture. She stayed just long enough to make small talk about the neighborhood and the weather before glancing over at his backyard and commenting, "You've got such a nice lot back there. Bigger than most of ours. You're lucky." It was an odd comment, but Matt didn't think much of it at the time. He nodded and said, "Thanks, yeah. It's one of the reasons I chose this place. I'm hoping to turn it into something special, maybe a garden or a workshop." Grace's smile twitched slightly at the mention of his plans. "Oh, I see. Well, just make sure you don't move too quickly. Things in this neighborhood take time, permits and all. And don't worry too much about the property lines. We're all friends here, right?" There it was, the first crack in her friendly facade. Grace's words lingered in his mind for a moment longer than he expected, but he brushed them off as nothing more than an old woman's idiosyncrasies. After all, she had been nice enough to bring cookies. As the days passed, Matt began settling into his new home. While arranging furniture and cleaning out old fixtures, he frequently found himself in the backyard, imagining how he might transform the space. The yard was partially fenced, with the back half bordered by a slightly crooked wooden barrier that had clearly been there for decades. Beyond the fence, he could see Grace's backyard, where a large stone patio extended just over the line onto what appeared to be Matt's property. It was subtle, but once he noticed it, he couldn't unsee it. At first, he thought it might be an optical illusion or an error in the fence's placement. Still, something about the way the stones extended just a little too far nagged at him. One afternoon, as he was clearing out weeds near the fence, Grace appeared again, this time leaning casually on her side of the barrier. "Making progress, huh?" she said with a smile. "I love seeing people take pride in their homes." "Yeah," Matt replied, wiping sweat from his brow, "just trying to get everything in order. By the way, do you know much about this fence? It's been here a while, hasn't it?" "Oh yes," Grace said, her smile never faltering. "That fence has been there since long before I moved in. Solid as a rock. You're not planning on changing it, are you?" "Not sure yet," Matt said carefully. "I might check the property lines to be sure it's in the right place. It looks like your patio might be a little close to the edge, or even a bit over the line." Grace's expression hardened for a split second before she forced a laugh. "Oh, that old thing? It's been like that for years. The previous owner of your house and I had an understanding. Neighborly agreements and all. Nothing to worry about. Besides, a few stones don't hurt anyone, right?" Matt nodded non-committally, but the unease was back. He wasn't sure if it was her tone or the way she dismissed his comments so quickly, but something felt off. Still, he decided not to press the issue. Grace was just a neighbor, after all, and there was no need to start a conflict so soon after moving in. However, As the weeks went by, that uneasy feeling only grew. Whenever Matt worked in the backyard, Grace seemed to appear. Sometimes she would wave and make small talk, but more often than not, she just watched from her patio or garden, her gaze sharp and unwavering. He caught her peeking through her curtains once or twice when he walked past her house, and he couldn't shake the sense that she was keeping tabs on him. One evening, while going through the box of documents he'd received when purchasing the house, Matt decided to pull out the property survey. He hadn't thought much about it during the buying process, but now he was curious. He laid the survey out on his kitchen table and traced the lines with his finger. Sure enough, the survey confirmed what he had suspected. The property line ran nearly a meter into what was now Grace's patio. For a moment, Matt just stared at the paper, debating what to do. Was it worth bringing up again? Grace didn't seem like the type to admit she was in the wrong, and he had no idea how long her patio had been encroaching on his land. Still, it wasn't just about the stones, it was about principle. This was his home now, and if he was going to make it his sanctuary, he couldn't let someone else take pieces of it away. Matt made up his mind. The next time he saw Grace, he would bring it up, but this time he wouldn't back down. The moment finally came on a sunny afternoon when Matt decided to address the issue head-on. He had spent the morning in the backyard, clearing debris and laying out stakes to plan the borders for a small garden. Grace, true to form, appeared just as he was hammering a stake into the ground near the edge of her patio. She leaned against the fence with her ever-present smile, but her eyes were sharper than usual, watching every movement he made. "Starting a project?" she asked casually, though her tone carried a hint of something more probing. "Yeah," Matt replied, dusting off his hands. "I'm putting together a little garden. Maybe some vegetables, maybe flowers. Still figuring it out." Grace nodded, but her smile tightened when her gaze fell on the property stakes he had placed. "Well, just make sure you don't plant anything too close to the fence. Roots can be a real headache if they spread under someone else's property, you know." Matt straightened, deciding this was the moment. He gestured toward the patio. "Speaking of the property, I took a closer look at the survey I got when I bought the house. Turns out the property line actually runs about 3 feet into what's now your patio." For a moment, Grace didn't say anything. Her face remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, maybe, or annoyance. It passed quickly, and she let out a light laugh. "Oh, that again. Matt, we've already talked about this. That patio's been there for years, and the last owner of your house never had a problem with it. It's just how things are." "Maybe," Matt said, keeping his tone even, "but that doesn't change the fact that it's my property. I'm not looking to start trouble, but I'm planning on using the space, and we might need to figure out a way to adjust things." Grace's smile vanished. Her voice was still soft, but now there was an edge to it. "Matt, let me give you a bit of advice. When you live in a community like this, you learn to pick your battles. That patio has been there for over a decade, and no one's ever raised an issue. Moving things now would just cause unnecessary friction. Trust me, it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." "I get that," Matt said, unwilling to back down, "but I'm the one paying for this land now. I'm not trying to be unreasonable, but I think it's fair to figure out a solution that respects the property lines." Grace's pleasant demeanor cracked, revealing something colder underneath. "I see. Well, if you feel so strongly about it, I suppose you can do whatever you think is right. Just know that not everyone in this neighborhood will appreciate someone coming in and stirring up trouble." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Matt standing there with a mix of frustration and unease. Later that week, Matt received an official-looking letter in his mailbox. It was from the local zoning board, notifying him that a complaint had been filed regarding unauthorized landscaping and potential damage to neighboring property. The complaint specifically cited potential structural impacts to Grace's patio, which, the letter stated, might be affected by Matt's work near the property line. Matt stared at the letter in disbelief. He hadn't even started digging or planting anything yet. How could there already be a complaint? The letter included a notice that a city inspector would need to visit his property to assess the situation. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. Matt knew Grace had filed the complaint to throw a wrench into his plans. Frustrated but determined, he decided to get ahead of the situation. He called the zoning office and scheduled the inspection as soon as possible, gathering all the documents he could to prove that his work was fully within his rights as the property owner. When the inspector arrived, Matt walked him through the yard, showing him the survey, the stakes he had placed, and the plans for the garden. The inspector nodded thoughtfully, occasionally jotting notes on a clipboard. Finally, they stopped near the patio, and the inspector crouched down to examine where the stones met the ground. "Yeah, this is definitely over the line," the inspector said, tapping the edge of the patio with his pen. "It's not uncommon for things like this to happen over the years, especially in older neighborhoods. Still, property lines are property lines. If you want to move forward with reclaiming the space, you're within your rights to do so." "That's the plan," Matt said, feeling a flicker of relief. The inspector straightened and added, "Just be prepared for pushback. People get pretty attached to these things, even when they're technically in the wrong." Matt thanked him and walked him back to his car. As soon as the inspector left, Grace appeared on her patio, as if she had been watching the entire interaction. "So, what's the verdict?" she called out, her tone light but her expression guarded. Matt crossed his arms. "The inspector confirmed it. The patio's on my property, and I'm within my rights to make adjustments." Grace's face darkened, and for the first time, her voice lost all pretense of friendliness. "You're making a mistake, Matt. I've lived here long enough to know how things work. People who come in trying to change the rules don't last long in this neighborhood. You might think you're right, but trust me, this isn't going to end the way you think it will." With that, she turned and walked back inside, slamming the door behind her. The next morning, Matt woke up to the sound of voices outside. Peering through the window, he saw a small group of people standing near the fence. Grace was among them, gesturing animatedly toward Matt's yard. As he stepped outside to see what was happening, the group fell silent, their eyes shifting to him. "Morning," Matt said, trying to keep his tone neutral. Grace stepped forward, her voice full of mock concern. "Matt, I was just explaining to some of the neighbors what's been going on. Everyone here has worked so hard to keep this neighborhood peaceful, and I just hate to see that disrupted. I know you're new here, but there are ways we handle things, and it doesn't involve tearing up property that's been part of this community for years." Matt felt his frustration boiling over, but he forced himself to stay calm. "This isn't about the neighborhood, Grace. It's about what's fair and legal. I'm just trying to take care of my property." Grace sighed dramatically and turned to the group. "You see, this is what I'm talking about. Some people just don't understand what it means to be part of a community." The group murmured in agreement, and Matt realized Grace was rallying them against him. He clenched his fists, knowing this was only the beginning. Over the following week, Matt began to feel the weight of Grace's influence in the neighborhood. The murmurs of disapproval from the small group of neighbors at the fence that morning had evolved into subtle but consistent signs of hostility. As he walked down the street, friendly nods and waves from others turned into awkward glances or deliberate avoidance. Trash cans that used to be neatly lined up along the curb were now left partially blocking his driveway. His mail began arriving, slightly damaged letters crumpled, envelopes torn as though they had been roughly handled. At first, Matt dismissed these things as coincidences. But the more it happened, the harder it became to believe it wasn't orchestrated. Grace's presence loomed larger than he'd anticipated. Whenever he worked in his backyard, he could feel her watching from her patio. Sometimes she would appear casually sipping tea or pruning her garden, but her gaze always seemed to linger on whatever he was doing. Other times, she would loudly chat with passing neighbors, speaking just loudly enough for Matt to catch snippets of complaints about certain people ruining the harmony of the block, or newcomers who don't respect the neighborhood's traditions. Things escalated when Matt received another letter in the mail. This one was an official notice from the city, stating that his recent landscaping activities had prompted a review of potential zoning violations. The letter cited concerns about potential drainage issues caused by the placement of his stakes near Grace's patio, which could allegedly lead to flooding during heavy rains. Matt's stomach sank as he read it. He hadn't even begun any actual construction or digging. How could this already be an issue? There was only one person who could have filed such a complaint, and Matt didn't have to think hard to figure out who it was. Furious, he decided he wouldn't take this lying down. He called the zoning office immediately and scheduled a meeting to contest the complaint. In the meantime, he combed through the survey documents and his property deed, making sure everything was airtight. When the day of the meeting arrived, Matt found himself sitting across from a city official in a bland government office. The official was polite but firm as he explained the details of the complaint. According to the report, Grace had claimed that Matt's actions were destabilizing her patio, potentially causing cracks or erosion that could lead to costly repairs. "Let me stop you right there," Matt said, trying to keep his frustration in check. "I haven't done anything yet. No digging, no construction, nothing that could possibly affect her patio. I've only been planning my project and placing stakes for measurements." The official nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. "Do you have any documentation to support your claim? Property surveys, plans, anything that shows the scope of your work?" Matt slid the survey and deed across the desk, along with a written explanation of his plans. The official examined them carefully, his expression softening slightly. "This does line up with your property boundaries," he admitted. "And there's no indication here that your project would impact her patio. I'll need to schedule a site visit to confirm. But on the surface, this looks like a non-issue." Matt thanked him, though he left the office feeling drained. He couldn't believe the lengths Grace was going to in order to disrupt his plans. It was becoming increasingly clear that she wasn't just being difficult, this was a calculated effort to intimidate him and make him back down. The site visit happened a few days later, and the inspector quickly confirmed that Matt's stakes were well within his property line and posed no threat to Grace's patio. Though the complaint was dismissed, it came with a warning. "Be prepared for more of this. If she's already gone this far, she probably won't stop here." The inspector's words turned out to be an understatement. The very next day, Matt came home to find a handwritten note taped to his front door. The note, written in an overly formal tone, accused Matt of destroying the neighborhood's aesthetic and warned that his actions were alienating the entire community. At the bottom it was signed, Grace Miller, on behalf of concerned neighbors. Matt's anger boiled over. He marched over to Grace's house and knocked on the door. She opened it with her usual calm smile, as though she hadn't just left a passive-aggressive note on his property. "Grace, we need to talk," Matt said, his voice firm. "Oh, Matt," she said sweetly. "What seems to be the problem?" "This," he said, holding up the note. "You've been making my life hell ever since I brought up the property line. Complaints to the city, turning the neighbors against me, and now this. What exactly do you want from me?" Grace's expression hardened, her smile fading. "I want you to stop acting like you own this neighborhood just because you bought a house here. There's a way things are done around here, and you're upsetting the balance. That patio has been there for years long before you showed up. Why can't you just leave it alone?" "Because it's on my property," Matt shot back. "I'm not trying to be unreasonable, but I'm not going to let you or anyone else bully me into giving up what's mine." Grace leaned against the doorframe, her eyes narrowing. "Let me give you some advice, Matt. You can fight me on this all you want, but it's going to cost you time, money, and peace of mind. Is that really what you want? Because I don't have anything to lose." Matt stared at her, stunned by her bluntness. For a moment, he considered firing back, but he realized there was no point. Grace wasn't going to back down, and every word he said would only add fuel to the fire. "Have a nice day, Grace," he said curtly, turning and walking away. Over the next week, Grace's tactics became even more underhanded. She began hosting regular gatherings on her patio, where groups of neighbors would sit and chat loudly, their conversations always peppered with thinly veiled remarks about Matt. He could hear them from his backyard, talking about certain people who don't belong and how the neighborhood was better before. One evening, as Matt was locking up for the night, he noticed something unusual. His backyard floodlight, which he had installed shortly after moving in, was flickering erratically. Upon closer inspection, he realized the bulb had been unscrewed just enough to cause the intermittent light. His blood ran cold as he looked around the yard. Someone had been here. Matt replaced the bulb and tightened it securely, but the incident left him shaken. Grace's campaign against him was no longer just about words and complaints, it was starting to feel personal, and Matt knew he needed to be prepared for whatever came next. The flickering floodlight marked a turning point for Matt. It wasn't just an annoyance or a small-town squabble anymore. This was personal, deliberate, and designed to push him into submission. He spent that night replaying every interaction with Grace in his mind, her words ringing with a subtle, venomous undertone that he'd previously ignored. When he woke the next morning, exhausted and restless, he resolved to do what he should have done weeks ago: fight back, not just react. The first thing Matt did was call a lawyer. He had been hesitant to escalate the situation into a legal battle, knowing it could spiral into months of conflict, but Grace had left him no choice. After a few hours of research, he found Alice Pierce, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who specialized in property disputes. On their first call, Alice listened intently as Matt laid out the history of the issue: the patio encroachment, the city complaints, the veiled threats, and the neighbors turning against him. "You've got a strong case," Alice said confidently, "but people like Grace rarely back down without a fight. She's clearly invested in maintaining control over that patio and the narrative in the neighborhood. We'll need to document everything, every interaction, every note, every complaint she's filed. It might get ugly, but if we're prepared, we can win this." Matt spent the next week gathering everything he could. He photographed it from multiple angles, highlighting the encroachment into his property. He collected every letter and complaint he had received since moving in, and even noted the times Grace and her neighbors had made remarks about him. Meanwhile, Alice began reaching out to the zoning board and digging into public records, looking for any evidence that the patio had been built without proper permits. It didn't take long for Alice to uncover something suspicious. Grace's patio had been constructed over a decade ago, but there was no record of a permit ever being filed for its extension. This alone wasn't uncommon in older neighborhoods where small projects often went unregulated, but Alice found something else: a complaint from 12 years earlier filed by another neighbor. The complaint alleged that Grace had extended her patio onto their property as well, though the issue had apparently been dropped after the neighbor moved away. "She's done this before," Alice said during one of their calls. "She's not just being stubborn, this is a pattern. Grace has a habit of taking over small pieces of land from her neighbors and banking on the fact that most people won't challenge her. If we can prove she's done this intentionally, it'll strengthen your case." As Matt processed this information, he felt a surge of anger but also determination. Grace wasn't just a difficult neighbor, she was a bully, someone who had spent years manipulating people into giving her what she wanted. This wasn't just about a few feet of land anymore, it was about principle. The next escalation came a few days later, when Matt received a formal invitation to a mediation session arranged by Grace's lawyer. The letter claimed that Grace wanted to resolve the issue amicably without involving the courts. Alice warned Matt that this was likely a tactic to undermine his position. "She's trying to frame herself as the reasonable one," Alice said. "But mediation can still work in our favor if we're prepared. Bring every piece of evidence we've gathered, and don't let her steer the conversation." On the day of the mediation, Matt arrived at a neutral office building downtown. Grace was already there, seated at one end of a long conference table, her demeanor calm and composed. Beside her sat her son, Josh, a corporate attorney whose expensive suit and smug expression made it clear he thought this would be an easy win. Matt sat opposite them, with Alice by his side, and the mediator, a middle-aged woman with a calm but firm presence, took her seat at the head of the table. Grace opened the session with her usual charm, painting herself as a victim of Matt's unreasonable demands. She claimed that the patio had been part of her property for decades, and that moving it would not only be costly, but would destroy the harmony of the neighborhood. She even pulled out a handwritten map, claiming it was from the previous owner of Matt's house, which she said proved the patio had been approved long ago. Matt could hardly believe the audacity of her argument. The map was crude, with no official markings or signatures, and it directly contradicted the professional survey he had in his hands. Alice didn't hesitate to dismantle Grace's claims. She presented the official property survey, Matt's deed, and the zoning board's confirmation that the patio was encroaching. "The law is clear," Alice said, her tone razor sharp. "Property lines aren't subject to neighborly agreements or informal maps. The patio is on my client's land, and Grace Miller has no legal claim to it." Grace's smile faltered, but she quickly pivoted. Maybe the law says one thing, but this is about more than laws. This is about community, about respecting the history of the neighborhood. My husband and I built that patio together. It's a part of my home, my memories. Doesn't that count for something? For a moment, the room was silent. Even Matt felt a pang of guilt at the emotion in her voice, but Alice remained unfazed. While we can sympathize with the sentimental value of the patio, Alice said firmly, that doesn't give Miss Miller the right to claim land that isn't hers. Sentiment doesn't override property law. Josh, clearly annoyed, jumped in. Look, my mother isn't trying to take anything that doesn't belong to her. She just wants to keep what's been hers for years. If Mr. Weston insists on tearing up her patio, we'll have no choice but to pursue legal action for damages. Alice raised an eyebrow. Damages for what? Using land she doesn't own? Filing baseless complaints to harass my client? I'd love to see how that holds up in court. The mediator stepped in, attempting to steer the conversation back to a neutral ground, but the damage was done. Grace's facade of reasonableness had cracked, and her frustration was evident. By the end of the session, it was clear that mediation wouldn't resolve anything. As they left the building, Matt turned to Alice. So what now? We keep pushing, Alice said. She's on shaky ground. The more we press, the more likely she is to make a mistake. That night, Matt felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The mediation had gone in his favor, but Grace wasn't the type to give up easily. Sure enough, the next morning, another letter arrived, this time from the Homeowners Association, claiming that his garden stakes violated community standards. Matt's frustration reached a boiling point. Grace was clearly pulling every string she could to stop him, and it was working. But as he reread the letter, an idea began to form in his mind. If Grace wanted to play dirty, he would respond with facts and persistence. He wasn't going anywhere, and he wasn't going to let her win. Matt stared at the letter from the Homeowners Association, his frustration simmering into anger. Grace's influence was spreading further than he'd expected, and now she was weaponizing the HOA against him. The letter accused him of unauthorized installations on his property and cited the stakes he had placed for his garden as a violation of community regulations. The notice demanded immediate removal of the stakes and warned that continued non-compliance could result in fines. Matt knew this was Grace's doing. The timing was too convenient, and she had already proven she wasn't above using underhanded tactics. He called Alice and read the letter to her over the phone. "This is a new low," Alice said, her voice laced with irritation. "The HOA doesn't have any actual jurisdiction over your property line disputes. This is just intimidation." "What do I do?" Matt asked. "First, don't touch those stakes," Alice said firmly. "I'll draft a response to the HOA, including your survey and zoning approvals. They can't fine you for something that's completely within your rights, but this shows how far she's willing to go. Be ready for things to get worse." Alice wasn't wrong. Over the next week, Grace escalated her campaign against Matt, dragging more neighbors into the conflict. Matt noticed her speaking with people on the street, her voice carrying snippets of accusations. "He's tearing up the neighborhood," or "Who knows what he'll do next." One evening, while taking out his trash, he overheard a group of neighbors gathered on Grace's patio. Their voices were low, but he caught the words lawsuit and bad for property values. The social pressure weighed heavily on Matt. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere whenever he walked down the street. Neighbors who had once greeted him now avoided eye contact, crossing to the other side of the road or cutting conversations short. Even the mail carrier seemed hesitant, delivering his letters with a curt nod before hurrying off. Then came the dog incident. It was a quiet Sunday morning, and Matt had just stepped into his backyard with a cup of coffee when he noticed the flower bed he'd started planting was completely dug up. Soil was scattered everywhere, and several of the flowers were uprooted and shredded. At first he thought it was a raccoon or another animal, but then he saw the tracks of a large dog's paw prints leading directly back toward Grace's yard. As if on cue, Grace's golden retriever, Cooper, trotted lazily across her patio, looking utterly unbothered. Grace appeared moments later, sipping tea. When she noticed Matt staring, she gave him a cheerful wave. "Morning, Matt," she called out. "Lovely day, isn't it?" Matt clenched his jaw and walked to the fence. "Grace, your dog was in my yard last night. He destroyed my flower bed. Grace's expression turned to one of mock surprise. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. But Cooper's such a sweet boy, he'd never do something like that. Are you sure it wasn't some other animal? The tracks lead directly to your yard, Matt said, struggling to keep his voice calm. This isn't the first time he's been loose, either. I'm asking you to keep him under control. Grace's smile hardened, and she took a long sip of her tea before responding. Well, you know, Matt, if you didn't keep making changes to your yard, maybe Cooper wouldn't feel so curious. Dogs are sensitive to disruption. Matt stared at her, barely able to believe what he was hearing. She was blaming him for her dog's behavior. Before he could respond, Grace turned and walked back into her house, leaving him standing there fuming. The next day, Matt installed a motion-activated security camera overlooking his backyard. He hadn't wanted to go that route. He hated the idea of his home, feeling like a fortress, but it was clear Grace wasn't going to stop until she made his life unbearable. The camera proved its worth almost immediately. 2 nights later, it captured footage of Cooper digging under the fence and roaming through Matt's yard. Matt forwarded the video to Alice, who advised him to file a formal complaint with animal control. The complaint wasn't about revenge, it was about setting boundaries. Grace needed to understand that her actions had consequences. When the animal control officer showed up at Grace's door later that week, she didn't take it well. That evening, Matt found another note taped to his door, this one handwritten in Grace's familiar, looping script. You're only making things worse for yourself. Stop now before this gets out of hand. Matt took a photo of the note and sent it to Alice. She's threatening me now, he wrote. Alice called him immediately. She's trying to rattle you, Matt. Don't let her. Keep documenting everything. If this goes to court, every little piece of evidence will count. The breaking point came the following weekend. Matt was working in his backyard, clearing the last bit of debris from the area where he planned to start his garden, when he heard the sound of voices nearby. He looked up to see Grace standing at the edge of her patio with 2 men he didn't recognize. One of them was holding a measuring tape, while the other appeared to be taking notes on a clipboard. What's going on? Matt called out, walking toward the fence. Grace didn't even look at him. Just taking some measurements, she said airily. Measurements for what? The man with the clipboard finally glanced up. Boundary verification, he said curtly. Mrs. Miller has concerns about property lines, and we're here to assess the situation. Matt's stomach twisted. Grace was trying to undermine the survey he'd already had done, hoping to fabricate doubt about the property lines. You don't have permission to be on my property, Matt said firmly. We're not, the man replied, gesturing to Grace's side of the fence. We're staying on our property. Matt didn't trust that for a second. He stepped back and angled his phone to record the interaction, making sure to capture their faces and actions. Grace finally turned to him, her expression smug. This is what happens when you make enemies, Matt, she said. I told you this isn't going to end the way you think it will. That night, Matt reviewed the footage from his security camera. Sure enough, one of the men had leaned over the fence at one point, holding the measuring tape well into Matt's yard. He forwarded the footage to Alice, who immediately filed a formal cease and desist letter to Grace's lawyer, warning that any further encroachment or unauthorized activity on Matt's property would result in legal action. It was a small victory, but Matt knew it wouldn't be the last battle. Grace was relentless, and her threats were growing bolder. The escalation had reached a fever pitch, and Matt could feel the storm brewing on the horizon. He didn't know how far she was willing to go, but one thing was certain: he wasn't backing down. Matt had reached his limit. Every interaction with Grace, every threat, and every petty act of sabotage had pushed him further toward the edge. Her attempts to undermine him had gone from annoying to outright dangerous, and now, with her bringing surveyors onto his property and stirring up the neighborhood against him, Matt knew the situation needed a definitive resolution. It was time to bring everything to the surface. Alice filed a formal lawsuit against Grace, citing trespassing, harassment, and property encroachment. The case wasn't just about reclaiming Matt's land anymore, it was about holding Grace accountable for the chaos she had caused. The suit demanded the removal of her patio from Matt's property in compensation for the repeated attempts to interfere with his use of his own yard. It was a bold move, but Alice assured Matt that their evidence was solid. As the court date approached, Matt felt the tension mounting in the neighborhood. Grace's allies' neighbors she had charmed or intimidated continued to spread rumors about him. He overheard snide remarks about outsiders who think they can change everything and saw curtains twitching as he walked past. But there were also small signs of support. A few neighbors, ones who had been quieter throughout the ordeal, gave him encouraging nods or quick words of reassurance. One even admitted that Grace had bullied them in the past, but that they hadn't known how to fight back. On the day of the hearing, Matt walked into the courthouse with Alice by his side. Grace was already there, dressed in her usual polished way, with Josh sitting confidently next to her. She greeted Matt with a smile that was anything but friendly, and he felt the knot of frustration tighten in his chest. This wasn't a neighborly dispute anymore, this was war. The proceedings began with Alice laying out their case. She presented the property survey, zoning approvals, and footage from Matt's security cameras, including the clip of Grace's surveyor trespassing. She detailed the timeline of Grace's harassment, from the HOA complaints to the vandalism of his flower beds. Alice's delivery was calm and methodical, each point hitting with precision. Josh countered by painting Grace as a victim of Matt's aggression. He leaned heavily on the sentimental value of the patio, claiming it had been a central part of Grace's home for decades and accusing Matt of disrupting the community's harmony. He even presented Grace's handwritten map again, though its lack of official markings quickly undermined its credibility. Then Grace took the stand. She spoke in a voice dripping with charm and feigned hurt, recounting how she and her late husband had built the patio together, how the previous owner of Matt's house had never objected, and how she had always been a good neighbor until Matt came along. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years, she said, her voice breaking slightly. "We've always looked out for each other. But ever since Mr. Weston moved in, it's been nothing but hostility. I don't understand why he's so determined to destroy what's been a part of my home for so long." Matt clenched his fists under the table. He wanted to shout that she was twisting the truth, but Alice gave him a warning glance, and he stayed silent. When it was Matt's turn to testify, he laid out his side of the story with straightforward honesty. He described how he had discovered the encroachment, his attempts to address it civilly, and Grace's escalating campaign against him. He spoke about the damage to his yard, the constant complaints, and the impact her actions had on his ability to enjoy the home he had worked so hard to buy. "I didn't move here to start a fight," Matt said, his voice steady. "I moved here to build a life, to create something meaningful for myself. But Grace has made that impossible. This isn't just about a few feet of land, it's about standing up for what's right." The turning point came when Alice called the zoning inspector as a witness. The inspector confirmed that the patio encroached on Matt's property and that no permits had ever been filed for its construction. She also highlighted the footage of the trespassing surveyor, calling it a clear violation of Matt's rights as a property owner. Josh tried to dismiss the testimony as irrelevant, but the judge's expression grew colder with every word. By the end of the hearing, it was clear where the case was leaning. In her final remarks, Alice delivered the blow that sealed Grace's fate. "This isn't about community. This is about control. Mrs. Miller has repeatedly used manipulation, intimidation, and outright harassment to claim what isn't hers. It's time to put an end to it." When the judge delivered the ruling, Matt felt a wave of relief wash over him. The patio was deemed an illegal encroachment and ordered to be removed at Grace's expense. She was also instructed to pay damages for her repeated harassment and fined for filing baseless complaints with the HOA and the city. Grace sat silently as the verdict was read, her face pale and tight. For the first time since the ordeal began, she looked defeated. But as Matt left the courtroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. Grace had lost the battle, but she wasn't the type to give up entirely. Outside the courthouse, Alice turned to him and said, "We won, but stay vigilant. People like Grace don't just go away quietly." Matt nodded, grateful for the victory but prepared for whatever might come next. The weeks following the court ruling were a strange mix of relief and unease for Matt. Grace's patio was dismantled within days, her carefully arranged stonework reduced to rubble and carted away by contractors under the watchful eye of city inspectors. Matt stood in his backyard as the final stones were removed, feeling a bittersweet satisfaction. He had won, but the victory felt heavier than he'd anticipated. Grace, unsurprisingly, did not take the ruling gracefully. Though she kept to herself in the immediate aftermath, Matt occasionally caught glimpses of her through her curtains, watching him with a look that was no longer smug, but cold and calculating. The neighbors who had sided with her became noticeably quieter, their passive-aggressive remarks disappearing almost overnight. A few even nodded to Matt as they passed, though none apologized for their earlier hostility. One morning a letter arrived in Matt's mailbox. For a moment, his stomach dropped as he recognized Grace's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Bracing himself, he opened it, expecting another thinly veiled threat or attempt to reignite the conflict. But the note inside was something entirely different. Matt, you may think you've won, but you've only made life harder for everyone here. I hope you're satisfied. Don't expect this neighborhood to ever feel like home. Grace. Matt sighed, folding the note and placing it in a drawer with the rest of the evidence he had collected during their dispute. He didn't feel anger or triumph, just exhaustion. Grace's words felt hollow, the last desperate attempt of someone who had spent too much time controlling others and didn't know how to stop. As the weeks passed, Grace's presence in the neighborhood seemed to fade. She stopped appearing at her patio and withdrew from the social gatherings she used to host. Matt heard whispers from a few neighbors that her health was declining, though no one seemed particularly concerned. Then, one evening, as Matt returned from work, he noticed a moving truck parked outside her house. The front door was open, and movers were carrying out furniture while Grace stood silently on the porch, watching. She didn't look at Matt as he walked past, and he didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. With Grace gone, the neighborhood began to settle into a quieter rhythm. Some neighbors even warmed to Matt, stopping by to make small talk or compliment his now thriving garden. It wasn't an immediate transformation, but over time, the tension eased and the street felt less divided. One day, while clearing out an old box of documents, Matt came across an unexpected find, an old photograph that must have belonged to the house's previous owner. In the faded image, a younger Grace stood on her patio with her late husband, both of them smiling as they admired the freshly built stonework. For the first time, Matt saw the patio not as a symbol of Grace's overreach, but as a relic of something she had once loved and shared. He placed the photo in the box and set it aside, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Grace had been wrong, there was no doubt about that, but in her stubbornness, there was also a kind of sadness, a refusal to let go of the past even as the world moved on. That evening, Matt invited a few neighbors over for a small barbecue in his newly restored backyard. As they laughed and chatted, he realized that his fight with Grace had not only won him back his property, but had also forced the neighborhood to confront the toxic dynamics she had nurtured for so long. By the time the sun set, Matt felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. His backyard, once the center of so much conflict, was now a place of joy and connection. He finally felt at home, not just in his house, but in the community he had fought so hard to be part of.